Good evening. Today I'm visiting my good friend and brother Jonah and his family, and he asked me just to sit down and record a short message. At supper time he mentioned that as Christians we are strangers in this world, and I thought it would be a good idea to talk a little bit more about that and kind of what that means for us as Christians. And I think we often hear of ourselves as being strangers and pilgrims. As Christians, we are strangers and we are pilgrims. But where does that come from, and what does that exactly mean? And in the first epistle to Peter, Peter uses that phrase, "I exhort you as strangers and pilgrims." And so we know that as Christians, we should be strangers and pilgrims. That should be something that characterizes us. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how does that really play out in our lives? And to do that, I thought we should look at an example of somebody who really was a true stranger, who really was a true pilgrim, somebody from the Bible who kind of gives us a little bit of an idea, who kind of gave us an example of what this can be. And that person is actually Abraham. And you'll remember that before Abraham was called Abraham, he was named Abram. And when he was Abram, he lived in originally the Ur of the Chaldees. This is where he was when God had originally called him. So at the end of Genesis 11 and then into chapter 12, you see where God had called Abram out of the Ur of the Chaldees. And he had said in the first verse of chapter 12, it says, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee." And so the Lord is now speaking directly to Abraham and saying, get out of this place. And he leaves three things behind. He says, out of thy country, thy kindred, and thy father's house. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned from those three different things that I don't want to get into right now. But this is where we have this original call for Abraham. And then as you go through the next few chapters of Genesis, you see him leaving that place. And then you see kind of these ups and downs in Abraham's life, and where he is doing things completely in the will of the Lord, doing what the Lord wants him to do. And then you also see, like any other man, that he also had his failures. As he is traveling, though, and as you follow the progress of Abraham, you find two recurrent themes. One of these is that when he gets to his destination, or when he gets to a place, it says that he builds an altar. And this is a wonderful characteristic of Abraham and of Abraham. He was a man who built an altar. And what this reminds us of is that Abraham was a worshiper. And this is something that should characterize us as well. And again, though, is not something I'm going to talk about too much right now. The other thing that you often find that Abraham did, in addition to building an altar, is that Abraham also pitched a tent. And this is what I want to spend more time on right now, because when he pitched a tent, what Abraham was doing was saying, I'm a stranger. And the reason is that when you visit somewhere, if you are buying a house, you are not saying, I'm a stranger. You're saying, this is where I belong, this is where I am settling down. But when you pitch a tent somewhere, everybody knows he's just here temporarily, right? I put my tent here because I'm going to be leaving the next day. I'm going to be moving on. And so Abraham was really somebody who had this character of being a stranger and being a pilgrim. Again, as I said in Genesis, when you look at the story of Abraham, you see he had all of these ups and downs. He had times when he was doing exactly what the Lord wanted him to do, and then he had other times when he was really doing what he wanted to do. But in the New Testament, we have another account of Abraham, and that's in Hebrews chapter 11. And in Hebrews chapter 11, you see so many different people there. And what's wonderful about this chapter is that it's really written from what we might say was God's perspective, and really showing us just the positive aspects that are drawn out in these people. And so when the faith of Abraham is recounted, we really only see the positive sides of it. And I just wanted to pull a couple things out of these verses. So when we look in Hebrews, what we see is that this is really written from what we might say is God's perspective, and that we really only see the positive aspects of somebody's life. And so we see Abraham as somebody who is living by faith. And so as we look in Hebrews chapter 11, what we find there is all of these people listed who were doing things by faith. And what we see in this chapter is really God's perspective, and you only see the positive aspects of what they have done. And when we look at Abraham, a lot of the things that he did that are recounted in Hebrews chapter 11 are really great examples for us as we consider our character as being strangers and pilgrims. And what I'll point out in the first verse about Abraham, in verse 8 of the chapter, it says, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, he obeyed. And just to make a couple points about this verse, number one, it says, when he was called. When he was called. This is very important. What this is saying is that Abraham went when he was called. He did not go before, and he did not go after. Abraham went at the time that he was called. At various times in our lives, the Lord may tell us to do something. He may tell us to go somewhere. He may tell us to act in a certain way, to do something at a certain time. Sometimes we want to do something early. Sometimes when the Lord tells us to do something, we want to wait. But this is not how we should be acting. Abraham went when he was called. And in the same way, when the Lord tells us to go somewhere, we need to be responsive to that. Because we are not tied into this world. Because again, we are strangers and we are pilgrims here. And why don't we talk just for a second about what that means? What does it mean to be a stranger? What does it mean to be a pilgrim? So think about it. What is a stranger? A stranger is somebody who you don't know, right? I don't know a stranger. So a stranger doesn't belong. It's very simple. A stranger is somebody who does not belong. What is a pilgrim? A pilgrim is somebody who is passing through. They have another destination, right? They also don't belong, but it's really the emphasis is that they have somewhere else that they are going to. They're on a journey heading somewhere else. And this is exactly our character in the world as Christians. We are strangers. We do not belong in this world. Yes, we're in the world, but we know we do not belong here. And number two, we are pilgrims. This is not our destination here, right? Sometimes we say, this is not our home. We do not belong here, and we are just passing through. We are strangers, and we are pilgrims. So to go back to the story of Abraham here, it says, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive. So it says, when he was called, and again, Abraham went when he was called. Not before, not after. Next, to go out. It involves leaving something behind. As strangers in this world, again, we don't belong here, and we have to leave the world behind as pilgrims. If we are so tied down with the things of this world, so connected with this world, then how will we be able to do what the Lord wants us to do? And when the Lord wants us to do something, then there are things we have to leave behind. There are things that must be put to the side. Then it says, into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance obeyed. And this is such a key here, that Abraham obeyed. And it sounds so simple that he obeyed. But right in the next phrase it says, he went out not knowing whither he went. And we need to understand what this was like for Abraham. Abraham was in a place where he was doing well. He was living with his family. Things were comfortable, right? He was with his family. He was with his kindred. He was with his father's house. Everything was fine for Abraham. But it says he went out not knowing whither he went. So he had this perfect place where he was living almost. Everything was going fine for Abraham. And God tells Abraham to go out. And then Abraham doesn't even know to the place that he's going. And back then, just think about this for Abraham. This isn't something where he could just travel from one place to another place in a day, and if it didn't work out, go back again, right? Abraham had to make this journey on foot with his whole family. All of his possessions all went with him, not even knowing where he was going. And this is absolutely tremendous faith that Abraham had. And this is how we should be in this world too. For us, the Lord might tell us to go somewhere, very close by even, And we can just go there in a few hours and come back. It's easy. And yet even with this, we can struggle. But Abraham had such faith that he was able to leave everything behind completely and go on this huge journey that he just couldn't come back from. And really willing to give up everything for the Lord Jesus. Why was he able to do that? That's the question. Why could Abraham do that? And it's because he was a stranger. Not just because he was a stranger, but because Abraham recognized he was a stranger. He recognized he was a stranger. And that's the last point I want to make. At the end of verse 13, it's talking about a group of people. These all died in faith. And at the end of the verse, they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. They confessed it. What does that mean? It's not that they so much admitted it, but this word confession means it was their way of life. A confession can mean their way of life. As strangers and pilgrims, it was their way of life. And this is the point I want to make, that we know we are strangers and pilgrims. We see this in Peter. We see this example from Abraham. We should be strangers and pilgrims. We don't belong. We're passing through. We know that. But now comes the next part. We need to confess it. We need to put it into practice in our lives. And we need to be like Abraham, where we say, when the Lord tells me to do something, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do it when he tells me to. And also, I'm going to be willing to give up any connection with the world that is going to hold me back from what the Lord wants me to do. And I'm going to go in faith doing what the Lord tells me to do. So let us take this lesson from Abraham. Let us know that we are strangers and that we are pilgrims. And then let us put that into practice in our lives, willing to do what the Lord wants us to do. So let us be like Abraham. Let us realize that in this world we are strangers, we don't belong, and we are pilgrims. We're passing through. And once we know that, let's confess that. Let's let that be displayed in our lives in the way that we are living. That we're realizing this world is not the priority in my life. That the Lord Jesus is the priority in my life. And that there are things in the world that I cannot do, that I cannot be involved in. Why? Because they will hold me back from doing what the Lord wants me to do. And because I do not belong here. I belong with the Lord Jesus.